Well, my interest in film was basically a fluke. The interest wasn't, but my finding myself here, I think, was, as happens. I wanted to go to the LA Arts Center and become an illustrator. My father would have nothing to do with it. And since he had to pay for me to go to school, and knowing that I was basically lazy and wasn't going to work my way through school, he said, do whatever you want, but I'm not paying to send you to an art school because, artists don't make money. So I said, okay, I'll go to San Francisco State and, become an anthropology major because I like that too. And then my best friend was going to USC, and he wanted me to go to Stockton with him and take the tests and all that sort of thing. And so we'd known each other since we were about 3 years old and gone to school all the way together. And I said, well, okay, I'll go and do that. And I said, well, what if by some kind of miracle, I actually passed and got accepted. And then I asked my friend, I said, well, what am I going to major in there? What am I going to do? Do they have an anthropology department? I don't think so, but they've got I know you like photography and you want to go to Art Center and study photography and art and things. I said, so they got this cinematography school, and I think they teach photography. I said, well, okay. And he said, it's supposed to be easier than PE. And I said, okay, that sounds good to me. So I went there, and lo and behold, it was a school where you learn to make movies. Now, this is interesting stuff. So that's what I want to do. And I like documentary filmmaking. When I actually got to school, and I sort of said, where am I? What am I going to do? I liked animation, and I liked everything. But I said, I think what I'm going to do is become a documentary cameraman, editor, and then make avant-garde movies on the side. Because I was extremely interested in non-story, non-character movies, just pure cinema. And as it happened at that particular point at UC, their focus was on the Canadian Film Board, the French unit of the Canadian Film Board, which was all non-verbal, non-character, non-story films. Right. So I just fit right in, and obviously just happened that the thing that I loved is what they were, that was their thing there at that point. In the group that I came through with, we all were very, very fixated on sound. And of course, I grew up with music and rock and roll and the radio, and I grew up with radio dramas. I grew up with, watch-along record albums, 78 albums, and they'd do a little beep and you turn the page. And so I was very connected into a kind of audio-visual world. When I got to film school, it was no different. And there was a particular phenomenon about that department, architecturally, which made everybody focus on sound more than you normally would, which I'm very grateful for. But whenever you played a movie there, in room 108, which is where we only had one room like this, and so when you played it, and they played it all the time, or you played a student film, or you were mixing your film, if it had a great soundtrack, everybody in the department would immediately rush into the room to see what was going on. So you became very aware of how powerful your soundtrack could be. And if you had a great soundtrack, you could tell how successful you were by how many people would stream into the room while you were mixing the film. I was asked to come back to school to help my old camera instructor. I was asked to come back and be his TA, because at that point it was the middle of the Vietnam War. The Navy was sending military personnel there to train them, and these were all, and it really wasn't to train them, it was guys that had been in the service for 20 years, and it was sort of their reward, I think. The one advantage to that class was that the Navy had all the cameras and all the film they needed. So I cut the class in half, and one half went off and did a movie, and I took the other class and we went off and did a movie, and that's when I made THX. Which was written by some friends of mine. Then they rejected it, and I said, well, I'll make it. I still like this idea. I'll take it, and I'll make it into something. So I had the thing, and I made it into a film that won, again, more awards. And I'd done a documentary, and it won awards, and I won, I did another little film that won awards. Just in terms of the National Student Film Festival, and in terms of all the festivals you could go to in those days as a student, I pretty much took them all. So as a result, I had won a scholarship, 2 scholarships, one to work with Columbia Pictures for Carl Foreman to do a little behind-the-scenes documentary on McKenna's Gold, And then another one to work at Warner Brothers. They had what they call the Sam Goldwyn Award, and you got to go there and work in a department at Warner Brothers for 6 months. There was one movie being shot on the lot, which was a Seven Arts movie, and it was being directed by Francis Coppola. He was only 25 then. But we all looked up to him because he was the only person who had made it into the film industry, only film student. Because in those days, basically, your chances of getting in the film business was 0. If you went to film school, you were going to be a ticket taker at Disneyland. You were going to go work for Lockheed, making industrial films, or you were going to go out and find a real job somewhere. But you certainly weren't going to go into the film industry. No one made it ever. So Francis had actually written a screenplay, he'd actually directed a film, and he was like the student film god at that point. So I sat there for about a week, and I'd gone around the studio to sort of see everything first, and then was sitting there for about a week watching this insane ritual they were going through. And got really bored, and I went back to the production department. I said, look, can I get off this thing? I said, I'm not learning. I learned everything I can about these kind of movies, and I don't want to do it. I want to get reassigned to the animation department. They said, well, there's nobody there. And then Francis heard, they said, your student observer wants to leave. He says it's boring. And he immediately came over. We were the only 2 people. I was 23, and he was 28, and we both had beards. We were both film students, and everybody else in the picture was over 60, literally. There wasn't. It was a Fred Astaire movie. It was the last one he ever did. So it was like, he said, "What do you mean it's boring?" I said, "Well, I've seen this. I have no interest in this, and I'm going to go to the animation department and make a movie." He said, "Well, look, you stick around, and you come up with one good idea every day, So I did that, and I had a Polaroid, and I would go around and get angles for him. Because as it turns out, Francis's real expertise is in the theater, working with actors, and as a writer, and a screenwriter. The 2 things I hate, especially in those days. I didn't even think they were, valid in any way. So all I cared about was editing and photography. So that was my area of expertise. So as it was, when I started doing this and picking angles and working in the editing room and all that kind of stuff, he got to sort of realize that I kind of knew what I was doing, and so we meshed very well, sort of 2 halves to a whole, and actually it was a great mentorship because, he said, well, if you're ever going to direct movies, you're going to have to learn how to write, because up to that time I had my writing classes, I'd gone through, I'd yelled at the instructor, he'd yelled back at me, and that's about as far as it ever went, but. Then he started to force me to become a writer and to work with actors and do all that theatrical stuff that I really didn't have any interest in. So it kind of was that sort of pushed me in that direction. So I had to sit down by myself with no money and write this screenplay, and then I took it around to all the studios. Nobody wanted to do it. They said, this is not a movie. This is a montage with a lot of music and no characters. And then they said, well, and you cannot tell a story by intercutting 4 different stories that are going on simultaneously. That just wasn't done in those days. You told one, if you have 4 stories, you tell 1, 2, 3, 4. But you don't intercut those 4 stories with 4 different characters that aren't parallel action. It was just too out there for them. And I went to every single studio in town. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. And so finally I got it picked up by the very last vestige of one of these, 60s youth, now we call it Fox 2000, but they used to have, after Easy Rider, they started all these little things, which the Zoetrope was supposed to be one. Well, Universal had one. Mm-hmm. And they'd made Two-Lane Blacktop and a few other movies, but now they were basically shutting down because it was a really bad idea. And I managed to squeeze in at the very last, and in the end they said, well, okay, we'll do this, but you've got to get a big star or a big name connected with it. I said, well, it's a movie about teenagers. I can't get a star connected with it. They said, well, we'll take a big name producer or somebody. And Francis had just finished The Godfather. He was like the hottest thing in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. So he said, yeah, I'll put my name on it. And so that's how I got American Graffiti done. Which at the time, it's funny now because almost all television is done the way the American Graffiti was done. It's almost intercutting any, CSI, or, I mean, it's been going on for quite a long time now, of having two completely separate stories going on simultaneously and intercutting them. But in those days, that was like too far out for any studio to even get near. And the idea of using music, existing music, and have it run all the way through, to have, a 110-minute movie with 110 minutes of music, it was just insane. Again, now everything's done that way, but in those days, it's funny that they would just not do the movie because of those very specific things that they had in their mind you couldn't do. After American Graffiti, these kids kept coming back and saying, "Oh, that's so great," and I got so much feedback of how it changed people's lives, and how, I didn't know, because, kids were completely stoned and doing whatever, and they had no idea that there was actually a youth, that you can actually be nervous about girls, and you can actually, be normal, which is the way it really is. Because in those days, it wasn't like that, just, get stoned and fall into bed with somebody. Even if you're 14, it didn't make any difference. So it's like all the kind of drama that a teenager normally goes through didn't exist in those days. So, and a lot of the kids, when they came back, said, "Oh, that's what it's all about. Oh, yeah, I feel that way inside. It's just that I never really got sober enough to really understand it." So I said, "Hey, that's kind of cool," and I was saying, well, if I can do anything, I'll try to pitch this movie. It doesn't work, then I'll go back to doing documentaries and doing what I want to do, and I will have taken this as far as I can. But I wanted to do a big studio picture on stages with sets, because I'd only shot street pictures, and in a real studio with real people and a costume department and all the stuff that everybody has. I said, I'll do one big Hollywood movie, the way Hollywood used to make movies, and I'll do it as a children's film. And I'll do it using mythological motifs of, basic psychological underpinnings and things I studied in anthropology. And then I will put it in this context of a Saturday matinee serial. Because I like the idea of starting in the middle and having it just be something that was in the middle. Originally, the three were going to be one. So it was just going to be one movie that just was this one episode of some bigger thing that you never got to see. Irony upon ironies, now mostly what I do is I write. Mm-hmm. For God's sakes, I'm somebody that hates writing, hates to develop character, hates to do dialogue, mm-hmm. Yet I've been nominated for 2 Academy Awards as Best Writer and countless other things, and I spend most of my time writing. Mm-hmm. But I think it's because I kind of do it in a very crafted kind of way.
What do you mean when you say crafted?
Well, crafted means you put the climax at the end of the movie. And especially if you go back to Joe Campbell and you go back to the archetypes and the old story, you realize that it's all just one story. And it just is, how good a storyteller are you?
Right.
It can be something you've heard or something you saw or something you lived yourself. And then it gets kind of quirky. But in order for it to really connect with people, it's got to have these kind of classic arcs of human tragedy or human desire, or which are very old and very tested. The reason they're very old and very tested is because it was an oral medium. You had to sit here like this with an audience, and you got paid for it. So if you weren't good at it, you didn't eat, because you went from town to town and town, and you sat around the fire and you told people these stories. And if they loved them, then you got a great dinner and stuff. If you didn't, they just kicked you out in the rain. So you would watch the audience, and when the audience started laughing or reacting, you say, well, that works. So you ad-lib a little bit every night, and then you say, this part here, they're falling asleep, so I think I'm going to cut that part out. So you have the same story of Troy told over and over, Gilgamesh told over and over and over again. And intuitively in your mind, mm-hmm. you sort of sense that that's something you care about. Those are problems that you deal with. So you could click with them. They're not dispassionate problems. They're, I also felt that way about my mother. So, and I wish my father. So if you get that and you connect and the story connects, then you can tell the story that way and you tell it well and the people connect with it and it goes on. So that kind of thing is where you make it work. And the story itself, the first act you just introduce all the characters. The second act you introduce the problem. Third act, you solve the problem. You know, now you can push the first act. You can maneuver it. You can take and introduce the problem in the first thing. You can do what I love to do is come in, forget the first act and just throw it out. Start in the second act. You know, and just say, well, you know these guys, and or like with Indiana Jones, you start with the last movie he did, and you end that movie, and then you start your new movie, and you introduce everything, and you introduce the characters. So you start at the end of a movie, and then you go to the beginning of another. You know, so you can take those, but the blocks are basically the building blocks. There's only like 4 or 5 of them, so you just sort of stick around. You can move them around any way you want. You can chop them up any way you want, but ultimately, it's just a different way of telling the story. I had to build a whole empire simply to make the movies the way I wanted to make them.
Well, but that's giving it a little short shrift, because one of the things I find so remarkable is, again, what you've done on sound in your films and what you've done with THX and the facility that you have to mix there. I mean, people try to catch up. It's just
But how does it work? It works because I care about movies. I mean,
other people can say exactly the same thing. No one else has a THX system. No one else has a system up there where they're doing their mixing, where it's different.
You're going to find anybody, any good director, Steve Spielberg, anybody, you're going to find, bottom line is, they love movies. Is Steven a human? Of course he is. You know, he's got 7 kids, he's got a life, but at the same time, there isn't a second in the day. You know the way it works? You know what they say about men? Is there isn't a second in the day that goes by that they don't think about sex? Well, a filmmaker, there isn't a second in the day that goes by you don't think about film. You know, that's all you think about. I mean, you're with your kids, and you're doing your stuff, and you're living your life, and you know, you're having sex, but you're basically thinking about film. And that's your life. And if that's you, then you're going to make it. Because the people that come in and say, well, I'm going to be famous, or I'm going to make money, or I'm going to do this, they're just doing a job. And you know, and sometimes and this is really a bad job. It's terrible. You know, you're dealing with the largest group of psychotic, neurotic, difficult people you could ever imagine on all levels. And I don't even have to work with the studios. And that's where most of them are. So you know, I say, there's a lot of easier ways to make a living. There's a lot of easier ways to become famous. But if you absolutely have to make movies, which is like, you know, people ask some kids, you know, why do you make movies? I do it because I have to. I wouldn't be alive if I didn't make a movie. I don't know how to do anything. I don't know how to live my life any other way. Once I got bitten and fell in love, nothing else existed for me. You know, and then fortunately my kids took over from that. And my kids sort of saved me. They sort of made me into a human being, or at least a half a human being. But if they hadn't come along, I would have no idea what being a human being was all about. Because I just, you know, and whether it's Marty or anybody who is a good filmmaker has that attitude, and they would give their life for movies.